Good morning, everybody. Like he said, I'm Elizabeth. I have been part of Oxford Community Church since 2018 when I moved to Oxford to start my undergraduate degree. So you might be able to tell, unfortunately, I am an American, but my family say I sound sufficiently British now, because being over here so long, I don't think so, and you probably don't think so either. But anyway, so yes, I'm based in Oxford, and I have been for the last few years. And still in Oxford, still being a student, I now am doing a PhD in the New Testament. So this Hosea, just remember, this is not my day job, the Hosea stuff. But I really love studying the Bible. I was that really nerdy kid in youth group who had different colored highlighters and asked all the really annoying questions. And it's great that I've now convinced loads of trusts to give me money to sit in a library and do that. So it's a good life. I particularly work on food and eating in early Christian communities. So this past week, I was reading Blessings for Cheese that the church in 3rd century Rome prayed. So, it's a lot of fun. But yeah, I'm really grateful to be able to be here with you this morning. And I wanted to start by just really thanking you and expressing my very real gratitude to be welcomed and to be hosted by this community. Particularly, I want to thank you for your attention to me this morning. It's not an easy thing to pay attention to someone. My boyfriend is a primary school teacher who's doing a master's in education at the moment, and his master's project is all about attention. So it's something we talk about a lot, and how attention is sort of the beginning of love, according to Simone Weil, but probably also to Jesus, I think. Hopefully you'll do better than his 7-year-olds, but I just wanted to express my real gratitude for being able to come and speak to you this morning. And before we get into Hosea this morning, I did want to offer just a bit of a trigger warning. I don't love that phrase, but it expresses what I'm trying to say right now, in that this book has, it's really beautiful and it's also really difficult. And I've felt that very deeply the last few weeks as I've been preparing. I've had several moments of actually just needing to close the books and step away and say, Lord, I do not like what you're saying here, but I'm going to press through into the difficulty because I trust that you are there and that this is your word and this word carries authority. And the fact that I'm finding it difficult means there's something in my heart that's out of line with your will and your purposes. But just know, please, that there's language of sexual violence in this book. And so if that's something that would just be incredibly unhelpful for you to engage with this morning, please do whatever is best for you. And I've sort of made the pastorally informed decision that I'm not going to read out any of the more graphic sections of the book. But don't take that as I'm trying to step away from the difficulty. I want to acknowledge that it's there, but also do the sensible and kind thing, because we all have very complicated and messy stories, and I want to be aware of that as we get into Hosea this morning. So I think it's so wonderful that you guys as a church are going through these books in the Old Testament, because they're kind of confusing, right? They're complicated, and it feels like you need to know a lot to really make sense of it all. And I've listened back to the other sermons you've had in this series so far, and there's been some really wonderful explanations of what's going on in Israel's history as these prophets are coming, and establishing some of the historical context that aids and helps us in understanding what's going on in these books. So by way of introduction to the book of Hosea, rather than going sort of the historical context route, which you guys have already covered in the last few sermons, I want to spend a little bit of time actually thinking about the literary context of the book of Hosea, and indeed sort of the minor prophets and most prophecy in I'm a scholar, so I've been conditioned to say Hebrew Bible all the time instead of Old Testament, but I know that I can say Old Testament here. So if I step over myself, I'm sorry about that. But I want to think a little bit about the genre and the form of Old Testament prophecy. And what I mean by that is poetry. So probably basically all of the prophetic literature in the Old Testament is conveyed to us through poems. And I think if we believe that the Bible is primarily revelation about God and who he is, then not only does the content of the Bible matter, but the form or the genre in which that content is communicated to us. Because genre just informs how we read anything. Like you read the news very differently to how you would read a novel. And that has a lot to do with the sort of the form, how the words, how the content is actually being communicated. And I think so much of the prophecy in the Old Testament, the prophecy for the people of Israel, is communicated in poetry because poetry actually does something really special to help us understand God and who he is. It's not just a more pretentious and confusing way of saying something, which is I know a lot of people say they don't like poetry, they feel it's too complicated. Well, I'll tell you, if you've ever read a psalm, you've read poetry, right? That's what the Psalms are. And so I want to spend just a little bit of time thinking about what poetry does before we get into reading some poetry. And I think there are three important things that I think poetry helps accomplish in the specific case of the prophetic messages for the people of Israel. And firstly, memory. It's very easy to memorize poems. I grew up with a very sort of literarily inclined father, and so we just memorized lots of poems growing up, and I can still sort of say them back to this day. If you ask me to say a Robert Frost poem later, I got you. Not that anyone really wants that, but. So poetry helps our memory because it focuses our attention, right? Coming back to attention. It slows down our reading, makes us pay closer attention to the words, what they're saying, and that just helps us remember them. And it's helpful to remember the prophecy, right? It's helpful to remember the things that God is saying to his people, what he said to the people of Israel, but also what he says to us today. So poetry helps us remember. I think as well, poetry is meant to sort of stir up our emotions. I find words very powerful. Something about poetry, the slowness of the words one after the other, just does something in my soul. I very often, I'll sit on a Sunday afternoon and read poems as a restful activity, and I will just cry most of the time because it does something, right? It does, when you slow down, you pay attention, and it's all this rich language being used. I think it does something to our emotion, and that's important because God wants to meet us in our emotions. We're not just trying to stir something up for hype or for the sake of it or have emotions for the sake of emotions, but God wants to meet us through our emotions because he created us. He created our bodies to react to things in certain ways, and poetry has a particular ability to stir up emotion. And the final point is that just poetry, and Hebrew poetry especially, is very invitational because it's almost always there's almost always a voice or a specific speaker saying the poems. And often in prophecy, that's God. And God is speaking to us in the poetry. He's saying things. And so the question I like to ask when I read the poetry in the Old Testament is, what is God inviting me into? What is he saying? What is the invitation here? And so, like I said, poetry is not just a pretentious way to say something that you could say more simply, but it helps us to expand our sense of God and who he is, how he makes himself known, and what he's sort of getting up to in the world. And I thought I would read for you part of a poem that I really love right now by one of my favorite poets named Denise Levertov. The poem is called "To Live in the Mercy of God." And I'm going to read the second half of it because it's helped me in my preparation for Hosea, and I'll refer back to it a few times, the ideas she's expressing in this poem. So, to live in the mercy of God, to feel vibrate the enraptured waterfall, flinging itself unabating down and down to clenched fists of rock. Swiftness of plunge, hour after year after century, oh or ah, interrupted voice many strained, to breathe spray, the smoke of it. Arcs of steel-white foam, glissades of fugitive jade, barely perceptible, such passion, rage, or joy. Thus, not mild, not temperate, God's love for the world, vast flood of mercy flung unresistant. That idea that God's love for the world is not mild nor temperate, but is the experience of standing in front of a waterfall as it flings itself down year after hour after century. I think what this poem does is communicate something that a simple sort of story, if she just said, like, I stood under this waterfall and it helped me think about God's love, like, it just doesn't do the same thing, right? But the passion of the waterfall flinging itself down to the unabating rock, that passion, rage, or joy, it's helped me think a little bit about how God's love is communicated through the prophet Hosea. So this morning, I'm going to focus primarily on the first 3 chapters of Hosea, not because I think the rest of it's bad, but I think it's part of what makes this book so distinctive in this sort of collection of the minor prophets. And it does this great thing of actually introducing most of the key themes of the book just right off the bat. And the rest of the poems in the book say the same things in slightly different ways, and I might refer to them at some point, but also just to help us, you're not having to flip around so much if we're just going to focus on the first 3 chapters. And so the first 3 chapters, like I said, they communicate a lot of the central themes of the book of Hosea, which indeed are also kind of so much of the central themes of the minor prophets generally. And so I'm going to focus on 2 of these themes today: covenant and land. And I should have said at the beginning, I'm not really like a 3-point sermon kind of gal. So again, I really do thank you for my attention. I kind of just have like buckets of things to say that came up for me as I was reading and processing these poems. And so that's what we're going to do, if that sounds all right. Better, because that's what I've got written down. So we'll start with covenant. Now, covenant is one of those words that Christians say, and we all kind of assume we know what it means, but it's kind of a strange word, like you don't often use it in normal language today. But the definition of covenant that I find really helpful, and specifically when we're thinking about God's covenant to his people in Israel, we can imagine it as God's abiding and perpetual promise and contract with his chosen people, Israel. So God's abiding and perpetual promise and contract with his chosen people. And this thing of the promise and the contractual aspect really sort of starts playing itself out in the poems in Hosea. And that's because the contract inspires obligation, right? When you enter into a contract with someone, both parties have to hold up their end of the bargain for the contract to be able to still be in force. And when you enter into a contract with God, obviously it's kind of impossible for us broken humans to be able to always hold up our side of the bargain, but that's what also makes it God's promise to us. He knows what he's getting himself into, and he decides to enter into a promise with us anyways, but he wants us to live our best lives, and he wants us to flourish. And that's why he gives us these set of contractual obligations, because God says, I made you, and these are the things required to be a good human. I know what's up because I'm God. And so that's what God's covenant with his people is seeking to do. Inspire obligation to God's self. And we come to the book of Hosea, and Israel has broken the obligations of the covenant. And so much of the minor prophets, and Hosea especially, is reflection on what it means that this covenant has been broken, and how in the covenant breaking, God's heart has been broken, because he desires so deeply to be in relationship with his people. And so the way Hosea chooses to express this is in the metaphor of marriage between God and Israel. And metaphors are really helpful because we live by metaphor. We make sense of the world in metaphor. Something is like this thing, so that makes me understand this, but also tells me something about that. And the marriage metaphor specifically works in this context because marriage is both a promise and a contract, right? There are implications when obligations to the other person in the marriage are not kept. And so Hosea And God, in this book, they use this metaphor of marriage to explain what God's relationship with Israel is like and what's gone wrong and what it looks like when it will be restored and renewed. And the first 3 chapters of Hosea, specifically in chapters 1 and in chapters 3, we get this. I know I was going on about poetry for ages. We do have some narrative in the book of Hosea, but we have this story of Hosea marrying this woman named Gomer, because God tells Hosea to go and be married to a woman who will be unfaithful to him. And so Hosea's marriage to Gomer is a kind of narrative manifestation of the marriage metaphor. In Hosea's marriage to Gomer, they've entered into this promise, which is also a contract. Gomer breaks the contract by being unfaithful to Hosea. We see this is what God's relationship with Israel has been like. And then in chapter 3, God tells Hosea to keep holding up his end of the contract despite the fact that it has been broken. God says to Hosea that you are going to still be married to Gomer, and they're reconciled and their relationship is renewed. And that's also an image of God's relationship with Israel. And so we have this marriage between these two people reflecting the nature of God's relationship to his chosen people. And actually, the name Gomer comes from the Hebrew verb, which means to fulfill. So there's something in this story about Hosea and Gomer that, illuminates something of what the fulfillment of God's promise to Israel is, that despite the fact that everything has gone wrong for them, and it seems that God is absent, and it seems that God is actually now actively against them, there's this hope, this promise that God has made that he will fulfill to his people, and their marriage relationship will be renewed. I do want to say, though, about the nature of the marriage metaphor. It is a metaphor, and I'm going to read a quote from one of my favorite Old Testament scholars named Ellen Davis, and her work on Hosea really helped me think through the more complicated implications of the marriage metaphor in Hosea. And then this metaphor is also used in some of the other prophetic books, but it sort of starts in Hosea. And Ellen Davis says, when unfaithfulness is gendered by metaphor, it is easy for the metaphorical character of the image to be forgotten and for real women to become the objects of blame and abuse. So rather than blindly replicating Hosea's condemnatory use of the metaphor, we ought instead to examine it, seeing what work it does within the prophetic message. The metaphor evokes a personal relationship that, however volatile it may be, is difficult to end and impossible to deny. Thus, the marriage metaphor implies that Yahweh's covenant with Israel may be unbreakable no matter how bad things get. God's covenant with Israel is unbreakable no matter how bad things get. That's what God wants to teach us through this metaphor of marriage with Israel. He's not trying to give us justification to abuse and discredit and not believe women. That is not God's heart for women. But there is something in this metaphor that is meant to elicit an emotional response. I've had lots of big emotional responses as I've been working on this sermon and as I've been sitting with Hosea. And so I've been trying to ask myself, what is the invitation, right, in this poetry? What is the invitation? What are my emotions trying to tell me about God and who he is? And honestly, it's still a live question for me. But I think that God chooses to reveal himself in ways which we can comprehend. And that's a real graciousness of God. God who is so beyond our imagination, beyond our comprehension, beyond anything we could ever dream of. He decides that he still wants to make himself known. And so he works with metaphors and with our little language that we've invented. And so the metaphor of marriage and the metaphor of adultery make sense to us because we know that in our lives, whether or not, I'm not married, but I have parents who are married, and I understand the kinds of emotions tied up with marriage and with adultery. And so it makes sense to me. It helps me understand what God's relationship with his people is like. And so I'm just going to read now from Hosea chapter 2, if you want to turn there. I'm going to read just verses 4 through 8, and then this is to help us understand the sort of the contractual side of God's marriage to Israel. So God says, "I will not show my love to her children, because they are the children of adultery. Their mother has been unfaithful and has conceived them in disgrace. She said, 'I will go after my lovers who give me food and water, my wool and my linen, my oil and my drink. Therefore, I will block her path with thorn bushes. I will wall her in so that she cannot find her way. She will chase after her lovers, but not catch them. She will look for them, but not find them. And so she will say, I will go back to my husband as at first, for then I was better off than I am now.' But she has not acknowledged that I was the one who gave her the grain, the new wine, and the oil, who lavished on her the silver and gold which they used for Baal." And so here in this section of the poem, we see the aspects of the contract that has been broken. And the main point, I think, that comes out in these verses is exclusivity. Part of the promise God and Israel entered into together, part of the contract, was that God, Yahweh, would be Israel's exclusive God. They would not turn to other gods. That's what that word at the end there, Baal, it's the word that's used in Hebrew for gods which are not Yahweh, Elohim. And so in turning to these other gods, Israel has broken the contract with her God. And the Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel uses the phrase political promiscuity to make sense of this nature of the metaphor. And because it's alliteration, it has to be right, But I think this idea of political promiscuity, right? Israel, the northern kingdom, has turned and is making all these alliances with other nations and then is implicated in those other nations' gods, right? That's the problem. And God says, nuh-uh. The deal was that I would be your God because I am so jealous for you. I don't want you going after anything which is not me because all of those other things are bad, right? It comes out of God's heart for protection and love and care for his people. But because the northern kingdom, Israel, has entered into these other relationships with other gods, because the covenant, the contract has been broken, there are consequences. There are consequences when his people do not serve him with exclusivity. And that's where so much of the difficulty in this book comes out, right? When, because, so the feminized Israel says, I will go back to my husband at first because I was so better when I was with God than I am now. And then God says, no, I'm not taking her back. She's not acknowledged me yet. And that's quite difficult, isn't it? Because we're used to singing about a God whose mercies are new every morning. We're used to singing out about a God who will never let us go. That's the kind of God we're comfortable with. That's the God we feel safe with. And I actually think maybe God is just a little bit more unsafe than we like to make him. Maybe he really does know what's best for us. And maybe what's best for us is not always just being comforted. I think of my boyfriend with his 7-year-olds. There has to be consequences when they act up, otherwise they'll never learn, right? And of course, the other major metaphor used in the book of Hosea is God as father and Israel as his child, as his son. And parents love their children, but the children also need to be disciplined because they need to know the best way to be in the world. And so while the things that God says in the book of Hosea feel extremely difficult for me. At the end of the day, I think they still reveal God's heart for his people, which is always kindness, always compassion, always love. But the way God needs that love expressed is in exclusive worship, because he is so jealous for us. And in God's love for us, he also expresses sort of the hope and the end of all things, and that is renewed covenant relationship with him. And so I'm going to read also in chapter 2, just a few verses later. So starting in verse 14, God says, "Now I'm going to allure her, Israel, and I will lead her into the desert and speak tenderly to her. There I will give her back her vineyards. I will make the valley of Achor a door of hope. There she will sing as in the days of her youth, as in the day that she came up out of Egypt. In that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband. You will no longer call me my master. I will remove the names of the Baals from her lips. No longer will their names be invoked." Right, that is God's hope. That is what God says is going to happen, right? In that day, our loving commitment, the promise I have made to my people, will be fulfilled. And we see this again in chapter 3 when Hosea and Gomer are reunited. And God says to Hosea, "Love her as the Lord loves the Israelites." And Hosea says to his wife, "You will live with me and I will live with you. You will dwell with me and I will dwell with you." That's what the verb there is, the idea of dwelling, which to me just feels a little bit, more deeper and more loving than just living. Like they are going to dwell together in this promise. And of course, the obligation is still there, and love is meant to, inspire continued obligation and continued holding to the contract. But that is God's heart, to be reunited with his people. He longs for the day where he will speak tenderly to us and we will call him our husband. But then how do these two things sort of coexist, right? How can God say that he's going to do all these terrible things to Israel and a few verses later say, "No, I love her so much, how could I ever let her go?" And that's where the waterfall poem has been really helpful for me, actually, right? Because God's love for the world is not mild nor temperate, but vast floods of mercy flinging towards us, shooting at us. And to stand in it is to feel the spray of it, to feel the spray of God's unquenching desire to be with his people. There is a danger to it. But God, because he is so loving and compassionate and gentle and caring at the same time, he gives us a way to be in relationship with him where we are safe from that danger, and that is the person of Jesus. Now, the other sort of major theme in the book of Hosea and in the prophets more generally is this idea of the land. And so I'm going to pick up where I was just reading in chapter 2. So verse 16, "In that day, declares the Lord, you'll call me my husband. You will no longer call me my master. I will remove the names of the Baals from her lips. No longer will their names be invoked. In that day, I will make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field and the birds of the air and the creatures that move along the ground. Bow and sword and battle I will abolish from the land so that all may lie down in safety. And I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you in righteousness and justice, in love and compassion. I will betroth you in faithfulness, and you will acknowledge the Lord." So this thing of God making a covenant with the animals, with the sky, with the ground, God's relationship to the people of Israel also affects the land of Israel. At other points in the Old Testament prophets, you get this idea that the sin of the people of Israel is actually sort of held by the land, and the land is sick because of the Israelites' sin. And so God's relationship to the people of Israel affects the land of Israel. And so what does that tell us about who God is? Well, he says that war will be abolished and that non-human creation will also enter into a renewed covenant with God. So not being in right relationship with God, not being a part of this covenant, has bigger manifestations and implications than just our own individual lives. And I think this is a lie that the modern era has sold us, right? Of like individualism, it's all about me and Jesus, right? We know it's so much more than that. It's about us and Jesus, but not only is it about us, it's like about us and Jesus. All the things are affected by sin and by not being in right relationship with God. And so God's heart is for all of his creation to be right, to be, made to reflect his image of rightness and justice and beauty. That is part of God's character, and what it means to be his people is to not only just focus on our own individual relationships, but to just expand our vision and our faith and our expectation for who God is and how he acts in the world. And so to be the people of God then means not only to enter into covenant with God, but we enter into covenant with God alongside of all the other beautiful things that God has made and the things that help us understand who he is. And so to be the people of God is to be married to God, to understand our place in the land. And I am a New Testament scholar, so I'm going to wrap up by looking forwards a bit, because in the immortal words of Chance the Rapper, my mama made me apple pies, lullabies, and alibis. The book don't end with Malachi. And so we're going to turn to Romans for just the last few minutes here, because I thought preaching on Hosea was too easy, so I'm just going to throw Romans 9-11 in as well. But Paul, who is one of the first Christians ministering in the generations immediately following Jesus' life, he has this problem that he writes about in his letter to the church in Rome, where he expected this group of people to start following Jesus, and then they didn't. But then the people Paul didn't expect to start following Jesus started following him. And so Paul's sort of wrestling with this specifically in chapters 9-11 in Romans. And we see, so I'm just going to read starting in Romans 9:22, and you'll see why it's relevant. So Paul says, "What if God, choosing to show us his wrath and make his power known, bore with great patience the objects of his wrath prepared for destruction? What if he did all of this to make the riches of his glory known to the objects of his mercy, whom he prepared in advance for glory, even us, whom he called, and not only the Jews, but also the Gentiles? For as he says in Hosea, I will call them my people who were not my people. I will call her my beloved, who is not my loved one." And so Paul interprets Hosea as a promise that all people, not just God's chosen people of Israel, but all people are chosen and loved by God. And this is us. This is what Paul says of us. Unless you are ethnically Jewish, you are part of the Gentiles who God has decided to bring into his kingdom. And so Hosea helps Paul wrestle with this question of who are the people of God. And I think it can be really helpful to look to the early Christians to see how did they make sense of the Old Testament. That really helps my reading of the Old Testament. So I think that's just generally a helpful practice. But for Paul, he takes this verse in Hosea, which was, in its original context in Hosea, it's about God renewing his covenant with Israel. But Paul reads that and he sees there's something more. This is about God renewing his covenant with all of his creation, with us who were not originally part of his chosen people, but with all people. And so what does it mean then to be the people of God? That phrase Paul uses, to be the objects of his mercy. I love that. What does it mean to live in the mercy of God? To stand in the story of God's love for the world, which is not mild nor temperate. but to stand there beholding the waterfall. And that places obligation upon us. We enter into a contract, right? And I think the most important part of that contract that Hosea tries to teach us is our primary obligation is to love God as our spouse, as our husband, as our wife, probably not, but to love God as our husband. And there's a sense in which reading Hosea, you get the idea that he is undone in love. And that's I've had moments in preparing that I've just been undone by the love of God, that kind of like uncontrollable shaking and weeping, that when you are confronted with how small and insignificant you are, how broken you are, and God comes to you and meets you in that place in his love, and he speaks tenderly to you, and he says, "You are my people, and you are my beloved." That is what the book of Hosea teaches us. To love God as our spouse. And I think that begins with attention. You can't love something very well if you don't pay attention to it. And so many of the things that we give our attention to is what we end up falling in love with, is who we end up falling in love with. And so my encouragement to you, just to go practical for the last little bit here, just to cultivate practices of attention. For me, that looks like waking up every morning, making a cup of coffee, and sitting with the Holy Spirit before my day and asking that he would help me pay attention to people, because I know I'm not very good at it. So many things in modern life rob us of our attention. So many things distract us from the fact that God is the one moving and working. It is God in whom we live and move and have our being. And I want to remember to pay attention to that. And in that place of paying attention to God, I think you learn so much more of his desire to be with you, of his desire to see you undone in love. So I'm just going to finish by reading those verses in Hosea 2 again. So starting in verse 21, "In that day I will respond, declares the Lord. I will respond to the skies, and they will respond to the earth. The earth will respond to the grain, the new wine, and the oil. They will respond to Jezreel. I will plant Israel for myself in the land. I will show love to the one I had called not my loved one. I will say to those called not my people, you are my people. And they will say, you are my God."